It was a crisp autumn morning at Windsor Castle, and 11-year-old Prince George was feeling restless. His family had come to visit his great-grandmother for the weekend, but the adults were busy with boring, grown-up talks. George had already finished his homework and was looking for something interesting to do. The young prince loved exploring the castle. There were so many hidden corners and secret passages that even after all these years he still found new places. His security detail knew to give him some space while keeping a watchful eye. After all, he was just a curious kid who loved adventure. George decided to wander toward the east wing of the castle. This part was older and quieter, with thick stone walls that had stood for hundreds of years. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, making everything look mysterious and exciting. As he walked along the corridor, George heard voices coming from around the corner. At first he thought it might be other staff members having a normal conversation, but as he got closer, something didn't sound right. The voices were harsh and mean. Someone was clearly upset. Being a curious child, George quietly moved closer to see what was happening. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall and carefully peeked around the corner. What he saw made his stomach drop. There was a royal guard standing with his back against the wall. George recognized him as Sergeant Mitchell, one of the guards who had always been kind to him. The sergeant looked older than usual, tired and sad. His uniform was perfect as always, but his face showed pain. 3 other men in security uniforms were standing around him. They weren't guards from the main detail, but George knew they worked somewhere in the castle's security team. These men were saying terrible things to Sergeant Mitchell. Their words were cruel and hurtful. "You're making everyone look bad," one of them was saying. "Real men don't cry about their feelings. Maybe you should find a different job if you can't handle this one," another added with a nasty laugh. George felt his heart racing. He had never seen adults being so mean to each other before. At school, if someone was being bullied, teachers would stop it right away. But here were grown-ups and no one was stopping this. Sergeant Mitchell tried to speak up. "I just think we should talk about these things. It helps everyone when we—" "Nobody wants to hear your sob stories," the third man interrupted. "Keep your problems to yourself." George watched as Sergeant Mitchell's shoulders slumped. The kind guard who always smiled and waved at him looked defeated. George could see that the sergeant was trying not to cry, trying to stay strong even though these men were being horrible to him. The young prince felt something burning in his chest. It was anger, but also something else. His parents had always taught him about right and wrong. His mother, Catherine, always said that being kind was the most important thing anyone could do. His father, Prince William, had told him many times that people with power should use it to help others, not hurt them. George remembered a conversation he'd had with his father just a few weeks ago. They were talking about bullying at school, and his dad had said something that stuck with him. "George, sometimes the right thing to do is the scary thing to do. But that's what makes it brave." Looking at Sergeant Mitchell being treated so badly, George felt that scary feeling in his stomach. He knew he should do something, but he was just a kid. These were adults and they might get angry at him too. What if they didn't listen? What if they told his parents he was being rude? But then he looked at Sergeant Mitchell again. The guard had always been so nice to him. He remembered how the sergeant had helped him once when he dropped his toy outside, and how he always asked about his school and his hobbies. This was a good man who didn't deserve to be treated this way. The 3 security men kept saying mean things. They talked about how Sergeant Mitchell was weak, and how real soldiers didn't need help with their feelings. George could see that their words were hurting the sergeant more and more. "You're embarrassing the whole team," one of them said. "Maybe it's time for you to retire early." That's when George saw something that made his decision for him. A single tear rolled down Sergeant Mitchell's cheek. The proud guard quickly wiped it away, but George had seen it. In that moment, the young prince understood that sometimes adults needed help too, even from kids. George took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the wall. His heart was beating so fast he thought everyone would hear it. His hands were shaking a little, but he remembered what his grandmother, the Queen, had always told him about being brave. She said courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing the right thing even when you were scared. The 3 security men were still talking, not noticing that they had an audience. Sergeant Mitchell was looking at the ground, trying to hide his emotions. None of them had seen Prince George yet. George cleared his throat and took another step forward. This was it. There was no going back now. He was about to do something that would surprise everyone, including himself. The 11-year-old prince was about to learn what it really meant to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. As he prepared to speak, George thought about all the lessons his parents had taught him. He thought about kindness, about fairness, and about using his voice to help others. He might be young, but he was still a member of the royal family, and that meant something. It meant he had a responsibility to do what was right. The young prince straightened his shoulders and got ready to change everything. George stood there for a moment, watching the terrible scene unfold. His mind was racing with thoughts and memories. This wasn't the first time he had seen someone being treated unfairly, but it was the first time he felt like he could actually do something about it. He remembered a story his mother had told him just last month. She had been talking about her own childhood and how she had once seen a girl at school being picked on by older students. Catherine had told George how she regretted not speaking up that day, and how it had bothered her for years afterward. Sometimes, "George," his mother had said while tucking him into bed, "we get chances to help people. Those chances don't come every day, but when they do, we should take them, even if it's scary." His father had taught him similar lessons, but in a different way. Prince William often talked about his time in the military and how soldiers looked out for each other. "A team is only as strong as how they treat their weakest member," he had explained during one of their walks in the garden. "And sometimes the person who looks strongest on the outside is actually the one who needs help the most." George looked at Sergeant Mitchell again. The guard was a big, strong man who could probably protect the royal family from any danger. But right now he looked small and hurt. George realized that even strong people could be vulnerable sometimes. The young prince also remembered his great-grandmother's words. The queen had lived through so many difficult times, and she always had wisdom to share. During their last tea together, she had told him something special. "George, being royal isn't about being better than other people. It's about being responsible for other people. That's a big job, but it starts with small acts of kindness." As George watched the three men continue their cruel behavior, he felt something growing inside him. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was determination. These men thought they could be mean to Sergeant Mitchell because no one was watching. They thought no one would stop them, but they were wrong. George knew that his position as a prince gave him a special kind of power. People listened to him differently than they listened to other kids. Usually he didn't think much about it, but right now, he understood that this power came with responsibility. The young prince had been taught about bullying at school. His teachers had explained that bullying happened when someone with more power picked on someone with less power. But they had also taught him that bystanders, people who watched bullying happen, had power too. They could choose to walk away and let it continue, or they could choose to speak up and stop it. George thought about his little sister Charlotte and his baby brother Louis. What would he want someone to do if they saw his siblings being treated this way? He would want someone brave to step in and help them. That thought made his decision even clearer. He also remembered a documentary his parents had shown him about his grandfather, King Charles, when he was younger. The future king had always been passionate about helping people who couldn't help themselves. George had seen pictures of his grandfather visiting homeless shelters and talking to people who were struggling. His parents had explained that this was what being royal really meant, using your position to make life better for others. But this wasn't just about being royal. This was about being human. George had been raised to treat everyone with respect, from the gardeners at their home to world leaders who came for dinner. His parents had taught him that every person had value and deserved to be treated with dignity. Looking at Sergeant Mitchell, George saw more than just a guard. He saw a person who was hurting. He saw someone who had probably dedicated his life to protecting others, only to find himself being attacked by the very people who should have been supporting him. The three security men were getting louder now. One of them was pointing his finger at Sergeant Mitchell's chest, saying things that made George's stomach turn. They were talking about how the sergeant was bringing down morale and how nobody wanted to work with someone who was soft. George felt his hands clench into fists. These men didn't understand anything. They thought being tough meant being mean. They thought being strong meant hurting others. But George knew better. His father had taught him that real strength came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The young prince took a step closer. He was still hidden from view, but he was gathering his courage. He thought about all the brave people he had learned about in history class. He thought about knights who stood up for the innocent and leaders who fought for what was right. Even when it was difficult, George also thought about something his teacher had said during a lesson about courage. She had explained that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing even when you were afraid. Right now, George was definitely afraid. His heart was pounding and his palms were sweaty. But he knew what he had to do. He remembered a prayer his grandmother had taught him. God, give me the strength to do what's right, the wisdom to know what that is, and the courage to act when the time comes. George whispered this prayer silently to himself as he prepared to step forward. The young prince looked at Sergeant Mitchell one more time. The guard's face showed so much pain and sadness. George couldn't let this continue. He couldn't walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. His conscience wouldn't let him. George straightened his back and lifted his chin. He was about to do something that would surprise everyone, including himself. He was about to learn that sometimes the smallest person in the room could make the biggest difference. George took a deep breath and stepped around the corner. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to walk forward with confidence. He had made his decision and there was no turning back now. "Excuse me," George said in his clearest, most polite voice. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 4 men turned toward him at once, their faces showing complete shock. The 3 security men looked like they had seen a ghost. Their mouths dropped open and they quickly stepped back from Sergeant Mitchell. Sergeant Mitchell's eyes went wide with surprise. He straightened up immediately, wiping his face and trying to compose himself. "Your Royal Highness," he said, giving a small bow. The 3 security men scrambled to show respect, but George could see the panic in their eyes. They knew they had been caught doing something terrible, and they knew exactly who had caught them. "I think you should stop bothering this gentleman," George continued, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. He had practiced speaking clearly in public many times, and all that training was helping him now. The silence that followed was deafening. George could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sound of birds outside the castle windows. The 3 men looked at each other, clearly not knowing what to do or say. One of them, a man with graying hair who seemed to be the leader of the group, finally found his voice. "Your Highness, we were having a work discussion." George looked directly at the man. Even though he was only 11 years old, he had been taught how to use his royal presence when necessary. His grandmother had shown him how to look at someone in a way that commanded respect without being rude. "That didn't look like a discussion to me," George said firmly. "It looked like you were being mean to Sergeant Mitchell." The 3 men exchanged nervous glances. They clearly hadn't expected to be confronted by anyone, especially not a child, and definitely not a member of the royal family. "We weren't being mean, Your Highness," another one of them said, his voice shaking slightly. "We were just talking about work matters." George had heard enough lies in his young life to recognize one when he heard it. Adults sometimes thought children couldn't tell the difference between truth and lies, but George knew exactly what he had witnessed. "I heard what you were saying," George replied calmly. "You were saying hurtful things about Sergeant Mitchell's feelings." "That's not okay." Sergeant Mitchell looked amazed. He seemed touched that someone was standing up for him, but also worried about what might happen next. "Your Highness, really, it's fine," he said quietly. George turned to look at the sergeant with kind eyes. "No, it's not fine," he said gently. "Nobody should be treated like that, especially not someone who works so hard to keep everyone safe." The young prince then turned back to the 3 security men. He could see that they were sweating now, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they found themselves in. "My parents taught me that we should be kind to each other," George continued. "They taught me that when someone is sad or upset, we should help them, not make them feel worse." The leader of the group tried to speak again. "Your Highness, perhaps you don't understand. This is an adult matter and—" "I understand perfectly," George interrupted, his voice becoming firmer. "I understand that 3 of you were picking on one person. I understand that you were saying mean things to make him feel bad. And I understand that's called bullying." The word bullying seemed to hit the 3 men like a slap. They looked shocked that an 11-year-old had called them out so directly. George had learned about bullying in school, and he knew it wasn't just something that happened between children. His parents had explained that some adults could be bullies too, and that it was just as wrong when grown-ups did it. "At my school," George continued, "if someone is being bullied, we're supposed to tell a teacher or stand up for them if we can. Well, I'm standing up for Sergeant Mitchell right now. The three security men looked like they wanted to disappear into the stone walls. They had probably never imagined that they would be lectured about bullying by a child, especially this particular child. Sergeant Mitchell was looking at George with something that might have been pride mixed with amazement. The young prince could see that the guard was touched by this unexpected support. George walked a little closer to Sergeant Mitchell. "Are you okay?" he asked with genuine concern in his voice. The sergeant nodded, though George could see he was still upset. "Yes, Your Highness." "Thank you for asking." "Good," George said. Then he turned back to the three men who were still standing there looking uncomfortable and embarrassed. "I think you should apologize to Sergeant Mitchell," George said. It wasn't a request, it was a statement made with all the authority his young voice could muster. The three men looked at each other again. They were clearly torn between their embarrassment and their recognition that they were being commanded by a member of the royal family. George waited patiently. He had learned from watching his parents that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply wait for people to do the right thing. His presence alone was enough to make them understand the seriousness of the situation. The silence stretched on, but George didn't back down. He stood there with quiet confidence, a young prince who had discovered his own strength and wasn't afraid to use it for good. The three security men realized they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. They had been caught red-handed by someone who couldn't be ignored or intimidated. The tension in the corridor was thick as everyone waited to see what would happen next. George could feel his heart still beating fast, but his voice remained steady and calm. The leader of the three security men cleared his throat nervously. "Your Highness," he began, "with all due respect, you're very young. There are things about adult workplace relationships that you might not fully understand." George felt a flash of annoyance. Adults often used his age as an excuse to dismiss him, but not today. He had seen what he had seen, and he knew right from wrong just as clearly as any grown-up. "I may be young," George replied, looking the man straight in the eyes, "but I know what bullying looks like. I know what it sounds like. And I know it's wrong, no matter how old the people doing it are." Sergeant Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, clearly amazed by the young prince's courage, but worried about the situation escalating. Another one of the security men tried a different approach. "Your Highness, Sergeant Mitchell here has been, well, he's been talking about things that make the rest of us uncomfortable. We were just trying to help him understand that." "Help him?" George interrupted, his voice showing disbelief. "You call saying mean things about his feelings helping him?" The young prince had heard enough excuses. His parents had taught him that people who did wrong things often tried to make their actions sound better than they actually were. They called it making excuses, and George wasn't going to accept any today. "Sergeant Mitchell," George said, turning to address the guard directly, "were these men helping you?" The sergeant looked conflicted. George could see that he didn't want to cause more trouble, but he also couldn't lie to a member of the royal family. "No, Your Highness," Sergeant Mitchell said quietly. "They weren't helping." George nodded and turned back to the three men. "See? He doesn't think you were helping either." The third security man, who had been quiet until now, decided to try one more approach. "Your Highness, surely you understand that men in our line of work need to be tough? We can't have weakness in the security team." This comment made George's eyes flash with anger. He had heard his father talk many times about real strength and what it meant to be tough. Prince William had served in the military and had seen real courage up close. "My father was in the RAF," George said firmly. "He's told me lots of stories about brave soldiers and pilots. And you know what he says about real toughness?" The three men waited, clearly not sure where this was going. "He says that the toughest people are the ones who aren't afraid to talk about their feelings. He says that real soldiers look after each other, especially when someone is struggling." George's voice was getting stronger as he spoke. He felt like he was channeling everything his father had ever taught him about courage and leadership. "He says that anyone can be mean to someone else, but it takes real strength to be kind and to help people who are having a hard time." Sergeant Mitchell was looking at George with obvious admiration now. The young prince could see that his words were having an impact on the guard, giving him some of his dignity back. "And my mother," George continued, "always says that the most important thing anyone can do is show kindness to others, especially when they're feeling sad or scared." The three security men were looking more and more uncomfortable. They had probably expected to intimidate a child, but instead they were getting a lesson in leadership from someone who clearly understood these concepts better than they did. So when I see 3 grown men being mean to one person who's already upset, George said, his voice clear and confident, I don't see toughness. I see bullying, and bullying is never okay. One of the men tried to interrupt. But Your Highness, I'm not finished, George said, holding up his hand in a gesture he had seen his grandmother use many times. The authority in that simple movement was unmistakable. The men fell silent immediately. Sergeant Mitchell has always been nice to me, George continued. Every time I see him, he smiles and asks how I'm doing. He cares about people. And if he's brave enough to talk about his feelings, then that makes him stronger than people who hide from their feelings. George looked directly at each of the 3 men in turn. Maybe instead of being mean to him, you should learn from him. The corridor fell silent again. George could see that his words were sinking in. The 3 security men looked ashamed now, realizing that they had been called out, not just by a member of the royal family, but by someone who clearly had a better understanding of right and wrong than they did. I think you owe Sergeant Mitchell an apology, George said again, his voice leaving no room for argument. This time the leader of the group nodded slowly. He looked at Sergeant Mitchell with what might have been genuine remorse. Sergeant Mitchell, he said quietly, we're sorry. You're right. We were out of line. The other 2 men mumbled their own apologies, looking embarrassed and ashamed. Sergeant Mitchell nodded graciously, accepting their apologies with the dignity that George had always admired in him. George felt a sense of satisfaction, but he wasn't done yet. He had one more important thing to say. And I think you should remember that being part of a team means supporting each other, not tearing each other down, the young prince added. Real strength comes from lifting people up, not pushing them down. The 3 men nodded, clearly understanding that they had been taught an important lesson by someone much younger and wiser than they had expected. After the 3 security men shuffled away, looking thoroughly ashamed of themselves, George stayed with Sergeant Mitchell for a few more minutes. The young prince wanted to make sure the guard was really okay before he left. Thank you, Your Highness, Sergeant Mitchell said, his voice full of genuine gratitude. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that before. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, George replied simply. Are you sure you're all right? The sergeant nodded, standing a little straighter than before. I am now, thanks to you. As George walked back toward the main part of the castle, he felt different somehow. He had done something important, something that mattered. But he had no idea that his brave actions were about to create changes far beyond what he could imagine. Word traveled fast in Windsor Castle. Within an hour, several staff members had heard about what had happened in the East Wing corridor. Castle employees had a way of sharing news quickly, especially when it involved the royal family. The first person to hear the story was Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper. She had been working at the castle for over 20 years and had seen many things, but she was amazed when she heard about Prince George's intervention. That young man has real character, she told her assistant. Standing up for Sergeant Mitchell like that takes real courage. The story spread to the kitchen staff during lunch preparations. Chef Robert, who had always liked Sergeant Mitchell, shook his head sadly when he heard about the harassment. Poor man, he said while chopping vegetables. He's one of the good ones. Always polite, always grateful for his meals. It's terrible that anyone would treat him that way. But what really struck everyone was how Prince George had handled the situation. The kitchen staff talked about how mature and brave the young prince had been. He's only 11 years old, said one of the sous chefs, but he acted like a true leader. By afternoon, the story had reached the gardening staff working on the castle grounds. They were impressed not just by George's courage, but by his kindness and wisdom. He understood something that those 3 security men didn't, said the head gardener. Strength isn't about putting people down. It's about building them up. As the day went on, something interesting began to happen. Other staff members started talking about their own experiences. Some of them admitted that they had witnessed similar incidents but had been too afraid to speak up. A young cleaning lady named Katie confided to her supervisor that she had seen other guards being treated poorly when they showed any sign of vulnerability or stress. I always wanted to say something, she said, but I didn't think anyone would listen to me. If Prince George can stand up for what's right, maybe I can too. An elderly porter named William shared that he had noticed some staff members being excluded from group activities if they ever talked about feeling overwhelmed or stressed. "Thought it was just the way things were," he said. "But after hearing about what the young prince did, I realized that maybe things don't have to be that way." In the security office, other guards began to have quiet conversations about the incident. Many of them admitted that they had felt pressure to hide their own struggles, fearing they would be treated the way Sergeant Mitchell had been. "Mitchell's a good man," said one guard. "He was just trying to help all of us by talking about stress and mental health. But instead of supporting him, some people made him feel bad about it." Another guard nodded. "Prince George saw what was right in 5 minutes. We've been watching this happen for months and didn't do anything." The story even reached the administrative offices, where secretaries and clerks discussed how the young prince's actions reflected the values that the royal family tried to represent. "He's been raised well," said one secretary. "You can see the influence of Prince William and Catherine in how he handled that situation." As word continued to spread, staff members began to realize that Prince George had done more than just help one person. He had shown them all what real leadership looked like. Some employees started speaking up about other issues they had witnessed. A maintenance worker mentioned seeing new staff members being excluded or ignored. A secretary talked about noticing that certain people were treated differently because of their backgrounds or the way they spoke. By evening, there was a quiet buzz throughout the castle. People were talking about kindness, respect, and standing up for each other in ways they hadn't before. Sergeant Mitchell, meanwhile, found that other guards were approaching him differently. Instead of avoiding him or treating him with suspicion, several colleagues came to ask him about his well-being and to offer their support. "I heard about what happened this morning," said one of the senior guards. "I want you to know that what those men did was wrong. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Another guard apologized for not speaking up sooner. "I should have said something when I saw how they were treating you." Prince George showed more courage than any of us. The incident had created what people sometimes call a ripple effect. George's single act of bravery was inspiring others to examine their own behavior and to think about how they could do better. Staff members who had never talked to each other before began having conversations about respect and kindness in the workplace. People started paying more attention to how they treated their colleagues and whether anyone was being left out or treated unfairly. The 3 security men who had harassed Sergeant Mitchell were notably quiet for the rest of the day. Word had gotten back to them about how their behavior was being discussed throughout the castle, and they were clearly embarrassed about being called out by an 11-year-old. As the sun set over Windsor Castle that evening, something had definitely changed. George's brave stand had planted seeds of positive change that were already beginning to grow. That evening, as the royal family gathered for dinner at Windsor Castle, George was unusually quiet. He picked at his food, lost in thought about everything that had happened that day. Prince William noticed his son's subdued mood first. "Everything all right, George?" he asked gently. George looked up at his parents, unsure how to begin. He hadn't planned to keep the morning's events a secret, but he also wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. "I saw something today," George said slowly, something that wasn't very nice. Catherine put down her fork and gave George her full attention. "What kind of something, sweetheart?" George took a deep breath and told his parents everything. He explained how he had discovered the 3 security men harassing Sergeant Mitchell, how it had made him feel, and what he had decided to do about it. As George spoke, his parents exchanged glances. Prince William's expression grew more serious with each detail, while Catherine's face showed both pride in her son and concern about the situation he had described. When George finished his story, there was a moment of silence at the dinner table. "George," Prince William said finally, "what you did was very brave. I'm proud of you for standing up for Sergeant Mitchell. But I'm also concerned," Catherine added. "What you witnessed sounds like workplace bullying, and that's very serious." George felt a mixture of relief and worry. He was glad his parents weren't angry with him for getting involved, but he could see that they were troubled by what he had told them. "Did I do the right thing?" George asked. "Absolutely," Prince William said firmly. "You did exactly what you should have done. But now we need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." After dinner, Prince William and Catherine had a private conversation in William's study. They were both deeply concerned about what George had witnessed. but they were also incredibly proud of how their son had handled the situation. He's 11 years old, and he showed more leadership than those 3 grown men, Catherine said. He gets that from you, William replied with a smile. Your compassion and your sense of justice. And from you, Catherine responded. Your father's military background has taught you about taking care of your team, and you've passed that on to George. But beyond their pride, both parents knew they had a responsibility to address the larger issue. If Sergeant Mitchell was being harassed, there might be other staff members facing similar treatment. The next morning, Prince William called for a meeting with the head of castle security, David Richardson. Richardson was a veteran with over 15 years of service and a reputation for running a tight, professional operation. David, Prince William began, we need to talk about something serious that happened yesterday. Prince William explained what George had witnessed, watching Richardson's face carefully as he spoke. The security chief looked genuinely shocked and disturbed by what he was hearing. Your Highness, I had no idea this was happening, Richardson said. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable and goes against everything we stand for. I believe you, Prince William replied. But we need to understand how this situation developed and make sure it never happens again. Richardson immediately began an internal investigation. He interviewed staff members, reviewed work schedules, and tried to understand the dynamics that had led to Sergeant Mitchell being targeted. What he discovered was troubling but not uncommon in high-stress work environments. Sergeant Mitchell had been encouraging his colleagues to talk more openly about the mental health challenges that came with their demanding jobs. While some guards appreciated this, others saw it as a sign of weakness or a threat to the traditional culture of keeping personal struggles private. The 3 men who had harassed Mitchell were part of an older group who believed that security work required absolute emotional toughness. They had seen Mitchell's openness about mental health as dangerous to team morale and effectiveness. Meanwhile, Catherine decided to have her own conversation with the household staff. She wanted to understand if there were other issues that needed to be addressed. I want everyone to feel safe and respected while working here, she told Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper. If there are problems, I need to know about them. Mrs. Thompson appreciated the opportunity to speak openly. Your Highness, most of the staff are very happy here, but there have been some concerns about how certain people are treated when they're going through difficult times. Catherine listened carefully as Mrs. Thompson explained that there seemed to be an unspoken rule in some departments that personal problems should never be discussed or acknowledged at work. People are afraid that if they admit they're struggling, they'll be seen as unreliable or weak, Mrs. Thompson explained. That evening, Prince William and Catherine discussed their findings with each other and decided they needed to take comprehensive action. This isn't just about those 3 security men, William said. This is about creating a culture where everyone feels supported and valued. George showed us what real leadership looks like, Catherine added. Now we need to make sure the entire household reflects those same values. They decided to implement several immediate changes. First, they would establish clear policies against harassment and bullying, with serious consequences for violations. Second, they would create support systems for staff members dealing with stress or personal challenges. But most importantly, they realized they needed to have an honest conversation with George about what his actions had set in motion. Our son needs to understand that his courage didn't just help one person, William said. It's going to help create positive changes for everyone who works here. The next day, they sat down with George in the family's private sitting room. George, Catherine began, what you did for Sergeant Mitchell was wonderful. But we want you to know that your actions are going to help a lot more people than just him. George looked curious but a little overwhelmed. What do you mean? Prince William explained how George's intervention had led to discoveries about other problems in the castle workplace, and how the family was now working to make improvements for everyone. Sometimes, William said, one person's courage can inspire changes that help many people. That's what real leadership is about. George felt a mixture of pride and responsibility. He was happy that his actions were helping others, but he also felt the weight of understanding that his choices as a member of the royal family could have far-reaching effects. Within a week of George's intervention, Windsor Castle began implementing changes that would transform the workplace culture for years to come. Prince William and Catherine were determined to ensure that their son's brave actions would lead to lasting improvements for everyone. The first major change was the creation of new workplace policies. David Richardson, the head of security, worked with human resources to develop clear guidelines about respectful behavior and zero tolerance for harassment or bullying. Every employee, regardless of their position, has the right to be treated with dignity, the new policy stated. This includes the right to express concerns about work stress or personal challenges without fear of ridicule or retaliation. But the royal family knew that policies on paper weren't enough. They needed to create real cultural change, and that meant involving people at every level of the organization. Richardson organized mandatory training sessions for all security staff. Instead of just lecturing about rules, these sessions focused on building a supportive team environment. "We protect the royal family," Richardson told his team during one of these sessions. "But we also need to protect each other. A strong team is one where everyone feels safe to ask for help when they need it." The sessions included discussions about mental health, stress management, and the importance of looking out for colleagues who might be struggling. Many of the guards were surprised to learn that talking about these issues was actually encouraged, not discouraged. Sergeant Mitchell was asked to help lead some of these training sessions, sharing his own experiences and explaining why open communication about mental health was so important in their line of work. Prince George understood something that took me years to learn, Mitchell told his colleagues. "Real strength comes from being honest about our challenges and supporting each other through them." The response from the security team was overwhelmingly positive. Many guards admitted that they had been carrying stress and worry alone, thinking that asking for help would make them look weak. "I've been having trouble sleeping since my father got sick," one guard shared during a training session. "I thought I had to handle it by myself. But now I realize that talking about it actually makes me better at my job, not worse." Meanwhile, Catherine was working with the household staff to create similar changes in other departments. She established regular check-ins where staff members could discuss any concerns or challenges they were facing. Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper, was amazed by the difference these conversations made. "People are more relaxed now," she reported to Catherine. "They know they can talk about problems without being judged, and that makes everyone work better together." The royal family also created a formal support system for employees dealing with personal challenges. This included access to counseling services, flexible work arrangements for people going through difficult times, and a buddy system where experienced staff members were paired with newer employees. But perhaps the most meaningful change was involving George himself in the process. Prince William and Catherine believed their son should understand how his actions had created these improvements, and they wanted him to be part of the solution. George was invited to attend some of the planning meetings, where he listened as adults discussed how to make the workplace better for everyone. At first he was quiet and a bit overwhelmed by the serious conversations, but gradually George began to contribute his own ideas. During one meeting, he suggested that new employees should have someone to talk to if they felt confused or left out. "When I started at my new school," George explained, "they gave me a buddy to help me learn where everything was and to answer my questions. Maybe new people here could have the same thing." The adults in the meeting looked at each other with impressed smiles. George's suggestion led to the creation of a mentorship program where experienced staff members were assigned to help new employees feel welcome and supported. George also suggested that there should be regular social activities where staff from different departments could get to know each other better. "Sometimes people are mean to each other because they don't really know each other," George observed. "If people talked more and became friends, they might be nicer to each other." This idea led to the establishment of monthly staff social events, including coffee mornings, group walks around the castle grounds, and seasonal celebrations. The 3 security men who had originally harassed Sergeant Mitchell were required to participate in additional training and to make formal apologies to their colleague. Rather than being fired, they were given the opportunity to learn and grow from their mistakes. One of them, the man who had been the ringleader, approached Sergeant Mitchell privately after one of the training sessions. "I've been thinking a lot about what Prince George said," he admitted, "about real strength being about helping people, not hurting them. I want you to know that I'm sorry, and I want to do better." Sergeant Mitchell was gracious in accepting the apology, and over time, the relationship between him and his colleagues improved significantly. 3 months after George's intervention, Richardson conducted a survey of all security staff to measure the impact of the changes. The results were remarkable. Job satisfaction had increased dramatically, stress levels had decreased, and staff members reported feeling much more supported by their colleagues. The young prince started something special, Richardson reported to Prince William. Our team is stronger now than it's ever been. The changes weren't limited to the security department. Throughout the castle, staff members reported feeling more comfortable discussing challenges and asking for help when they needed it. George continued to play a role in monitoring the improvements. During his visits to Windsor Castle, he made a point of checking in with various staff members, including Sergeant Mitchell, to see how things were going. "You know," Sergeant Mitchell told George during one of these conversations, "what you did that day changed my life, but it also changed the lives of everyone who works here." George smiled, feeling proud but also understanding the responsibility that came with his position. He had learned that even small acts of courage could create big changes, and he was determined to continue using his voice to help others whenever he could. The transformation at Windsor Castle became a model for other royal residences and organizations, showing how one person's bravery could inspire systemic positive change. 2 years had passed since that autumn morning, when Prince George had stepped around the corner to defend Sergeant Mitchell. The young prince was now 13, taller and more confident, but the values that had guided him that day remained just as strong. The changes at Windsor Castle had become so successful that other royal residences wanted to learn from their example. Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and Balmoral all implemented similar programs to support their staff and create more positive workplace cultures. George had become something of a legend among the castle staff, though he remained humble about his role in the transformation. New employees were often told the story of how a young prince had stood up for what was right, inspiring changes that made their workplace better for everyone. "It's become part of our culture now," Mrs. Thompson explained to a group of new housekeeping staff during their orientation. "We look out for each other here and we treat everyone with respect. That's the standard Prince George set for all of us." Sergeant Mitchell had thrived in the new environment. He had been promoted to senior sergeant and was now in charge of training new guards. One of his favorite parts of the job was teaching recruits about the importance of supporting their colleagues. "Strength isn't about being tough all the time," he would tell new guards during their training. "Real strength is about being brave enough to ask for help when you need it, and caring enough to offer help when others need it." The mental health support programs that had been created after George's intervention had become a model for other organizations. The royal family had quietly shared their approach with military units, police departments, and other high-stress workplaces. Prince William had spoken publicly about the importance of mental health support in demanding jobs, drawing on the lessons learned from the changes at Windsor Castle. "We learned that creating a culture of support doesn't make people weaker," he said during a speech to military leaders. "It makes them stronger, more effective, and more resilient." George himself had continued to grow as a leader. His teachers at school noticed that he was more likely to speak up when he saw unfairness, and his siblings looked up to him as someone who would always do the right thing. During a family discussion about leadership, George shared what he had learned from his experience with Sergeant Mitchell. "I used to think that being important meant people would listen to you," George told his parents. "But I learned that being important means you have to listen to other people and help them when they need it." Catherine smiled at her son's wisdom. "That's exactly right, George. Power should be used to help others, not to make yourself feel important." The incident had also strengthened George's relationship with his great-grandmother, the Queen. During one of their regular tea visits, she had asked him about that day at Windsor Castle. "I heard you showed great courage," she said with a proud smile. "Tell me what you learned from that experience." George thought carefully before answering. "I learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the scary thing to do. But if you don't do it, you'll always wonder what would have happened if you had been brave." The Queen nodded approvingly. "That's a lesson that will serve you well throughout your life, George. A future king must never be afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The 3 security men who had originally harassed Sergeant Mitchell had all remained employed at the castle, but they had become different people through the training and cultural changes. One of them had even become an advocate for mental health awareness among the security staff. Prince George taught me that admitting you're wrong isn't a sign of weakness, he told Richardson during a performance review. It's the first step toward becoming better. The positive changes at Windsor Castle had attracted attention from researchers studying workplace culture and leadership. Several universities had asked to study the transformation as an example of how organizational change could be driven by moral leadership rather than just policies and procedures. But for George, the most meaningful part of the whole experience was the ongoing relationship he had developed with the castle staff. They no longer saw him just as a young royal to be served, but as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. During family visits to Windsor Castle, George made it a point to check in with various staff members, asking about their families, their work, and their lives outside the castle. He remembers everyone's names, Sergeant Mitchell marveled to a colleague. And he actually listens when you talk to him. That's not something you can teach. That's just who he is. The story of George's intervention had spread beyond the castle walls, though the royal family had kept the details private. Among staff at other royal residences, schools, and organizations, the tale had become an inspiration for young people who wanted to make a difference. George's school had even incorporated the story into their character education program, using it as an example of how young people could be leaders regardless of their age. Leadership isn't about being the oldest or the strongest, his headmaster explained to students during an assembly. It's about having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. As George approached his 14th birthday, his parents reflected on how much he had grown since that pivotal day. The experience had shaped not just George's character, but their entire family's approach to their royal duties. That day at Windsor Castle wasn't just about George helping one person, Prince William told Catherine during a quiet evening walk. It was about our son discovering what it really means to serve others. And it showed us that we're raising him right, Catherine replied. He understood instinctively what it means to use privilege responsibly. For Sergeant Mitchell, the transformation that began with George's intervention had changed his entire outlook on life and work. He had become a mentor to younger guards and an advocate for mental health awareness throughout the royal household. That young prince saved my career, he often said. But more than that, he saved my faith in people. He showed me that there are still people in the world who will stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. As George continued to grow and prepare for his future role in the monarchy, the lessons from that autumn day remained central to his character. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding others, but about serving them. He had discovered that real strength came from compassion, not from power over others. The legacy of that single act of courage continued to ripple outward, touching lives and creating positive change in ways that George himself might never fully know. But perhaps most importantly, it had established a foundation for the kind of leader George would become, one who would never forget that the most important job of anyone in power is to protect and support those who cannot protect themselves. In years to come, historians might write about many aspects of Prince George's life and reign. But those who knew him best would always remember him as the 11-year-old boy who saw someone being hurt and decided to do something about it, regardless of the consequences. That moment of courage had set the tone for everything that followed, creating a legacy of compassion that would influence not just George's own future, but the future of everyone whose lives he would touch.